Hello, and welcome to Biology 103. Our first chapter is entitled A View of Life. I thought a very good illustration to introduce this chapter would be a picture of a bristlecone pine. These organisms are thought to be some of the oldest living organisms on our planet. They are thought to be some 4,600 years old. To put that in perspective, 4,600 years ago, the pharaohs ruled Egypt. So they are very, very old. Biology is defined as the study of life. The word biology comes from two root words, bio, which means life, and ology, which means the study of. Throughout the semester, we're going to learn that life on this planet is extremely diverse. As you can see from the illustration below, some examples of living things. The far left, you see bacterial cells. These are organisms that are one-celled or unicellular, as is this paramecium, which is classified in the kingdom Protista. Later in the semester, we'll talk about fungi. If you're taking 104, you'll be introduced to plants and animals. So looking at this illustration, you can tell that living things are extremely diverse on this planet and found in all locations. Surprisingly enough, though, it doesn't matter what we're talking about. All living things are made of the same elements. We're going to spend quite a lot of time in Chapter 2 and 3 talking about the elements that make up living things. And we are residents of the planet Earth, so we all are subject to the same laws of chemistry and physics. We'll talk about some of those physical laws when we deal with thermodynamics in Chapter 6. For a moment, I want you to think about what the word life means and what it means to be living. How can you tell if something is living or not? For instance, is this fire alive? Some of you may think that because it reproduces and it consumes, it requires oxygen, and it grows and adapts, that it does contain some of those characteristics that we think of as living. Fire is not alive, obviously. It's a chemical reaction. When we talk about what exactly life is, we define life as something that has these six characteristics. Living things are organized, and we'll talk about that in just a moment. They require materials and energy. They maintain something called homeostasis. They respond, they reproduce and develop, and they adapt. Let's briefly go through all six of those characteristics. Living things are organized. We refer to it as the levels of biological organization. We'll start at the very, very bottom with what makes up all things, living and non-living, atoms. Again, we're going to talk about atoms in chemistry a lot in Chapter 2. But for now, just know that an atom is the smallest unit of an element that's composed of electrons, protons, and neutrons. Atoms join together. They bond together to form molecules, the union of two or more atoms of the same or different elements. The next level is the cellular level. Very, very important. This is the structural and functional unit of all living things. So this is where we see, at this level, this is where we see those six characteristics of life emerge. The way that we would look at this is cells are made of molecules and molecules are made of atoms. There are some organisms that are unicellular or consist of only one cell for the entire organism. Other organisms are multicellular, and oftentimes cells come together, different types of cells come together to form tissues. Tissue is defined as a group of cells with a common structure and function. There are some organisms where different types of tissues come together to form organs. And then again, organs work together to form organ systems, which form the organism. Not every organism has organ systems or organs or tissues. There are some organisms that go up to the tissue level, but their tissues do not form organs. So we can even talk about the biological organization of living things above the level of the organism. For instance, if we wanted to study all of the species of the same organism in an area, we would refer to that as a population. Organisms of the same species in a particular area, a population. If I wanted to study how the populations within an area interact with each other, I would refer to all of those populations as the community. If I wanted to study the community, all the populations in an area, and how they interact with the non-living or the environment, I would call it an ecosystem, a community plus the physical environment. And then if we take all of the ecosystems on the planet, we refer to that as the biosphere. So these are the levels of biological organization. And we would look at this as the biosphere is made up of ecosystems, which are made up of communities, which are made up of populations, which are made up of organisms, and so forth. Obviously, as we go from atom to biosphere, when we go up the levels of biological organization, we are increasing in complexity. The level that follows is more complex than the level below. Realize that when you get to a level, for instance, the organ level, there are properties that are going to emerge at the level above another level that were not there in the level below. So as you increase in complexity, each new level acquires new properties that were not there in the level below. We refer to this as emergent properties. Basically, we're saying that the sum is more than the parts. Let's use the example of the organ that I mentioned earlier. The heart, for instance, very important organ used for pumping. So pumping is a property found in the organ, the heart. If you were to take that organ and divide it into its tissues, cardiac muscle tissue, nervous tissue, etc., none of those tissues in and of themselves alone would be able to perform that property of pumping. So pumping is an emergent property that shows up in the organ level here that was not present in the tissue level. The second characteristic of life is that living things require materials and energy. We normally refer to this in our daily lives as food. So let's think for a moment about why we have to eat food. Food gives us nutrients and energy. Very important. Nutrients, we've heard all of our life that we need to eat certain things because they are nutritious. But what exactly is a nutrient? Well, a nutrient is a physical molecule that's used in our metabolism. We're talking about the vitamins and minerals, the chemicals that we literally use in our metabolism that make up our cells themselves and our tissues. They're building blocks. Energy, on the other hand, is the ability to do work, and your body works all the time. Even when you are asleep, your cells and your tissues and your organs are working very, very hard. Both of these, the nutrients and the energy, are used to maintain metabolism. We're going to spend a lot of time talking about metabolism in Chapter 6. Metabolism is basically all of the reactions that are occurring in your cells at any one time. Very complicated, and here you have just a very simplistic illustration of some of the reactions that occur in your cells. Keep in mind they are occurring simultaneously, where what's produced from one reaction is being fed into another reaction, etc. So this is your metabolism, all of the reactions in your cell. Also, the energy and nutrients are used to maintain the organization of life. Remember that it takes energy to be organized. If you don't believe that, just take a look at a teenager's bedroom. It does take energy to be organized. So for your body to remain organized, it has to work. It has to use energy. let's spend just a moment talking about that energy that is so important. You've probably learned back in elementary school that the source of energy for most life on our planet is the sun. Very simple. There are organisms that are able to capture the energy from the sun. We call them photosynthesizers, and they actually take that solar energy and transform it or capture it into a molecule. They capture the energy into the bonds of the molecule chemical energy of carbohydrates. So, very important. This is what they do. And you don't need to memorize this equation right now. We have a whole chapter that deals with this. But I was just wanting to illustrate for you that these green plants and algae and some other organisms actually are able to take that light energy and use the raw materials of water and carbon dioxide to build this sugar molecule right here, that glucose molecule. Very important. You could actually trace every bit of energy in any of the food that you eat back to this reaction right here. All of our food starts right here. If it were not for this reaction, we would have no food. So let's talk about that energy and the nutrients in an ecosystem. Taking a look at this illustration right here, here's our solar energy. Those grasses and algae that are able to convert that solar energy into a carbohydrate are called producers. And then obviously those things that eat the grass and other plants are called consumers because they consume what these organisms have produced. So within an ecosystem, let's talk about the chemicals and the energy for just a moment. Within an ecosystem, the chemicals or the nutrients, we sometimes call them, are actually cycled. And I want you to think for a moment about what that word cycle means. Cycle means to continue through, to be recycled, to go on and on. And so, to illustrate this point, I would like you to stop and think for just a moment. We are primarily made of 4 different types of molecules: carbohydrates, lipids, proteins, and nucleic acids, which all contain carbon. So, the tissues, the cells, the molecules in our bodies all contain carbon. We are a carbon-based organism. So, where do we get our carbon? So we would have to get the carbon from the food that we eat. So let's say that I had a salad for lunch today, which consisted of maybe some chicken and some lettuce and some dressing. So where did the chicken and the lettuce get the carbon that made up their bodies? Because remember, we are all made of the same things. So the chicken would have gotten the carbon from the food that it ate. So where did the lettuce get the carbon to make up its structure? The lettuce would have gotten it from the soil. So you have to think again, why is there carbon in the soil? Well, there's carbon in the soil because living things have died and are decomposed, and those nutrients are fed back into the soil. So plant life would take up the nutrients, living things eat the plants, etc. So what we're talking about here is that chemicals are not used up when an organism dies. They continue, they cycle throughout the ecosystem. They move from one population to another in what we sometimes refer to as the food chain or the food web. And then again, when something dies, this hawk maybe dies, maybe this is our top level predator, and it dies. That causes all of those chemicals that make up its body to be, they begin to decompose, and they are returned back to the soil and taken up by living plants. So let's look now at energy, because energy, unlike chemicals, energy actually flows. Now the word flow is very different from the word cycle. Cycle means to be used again and again and again. Energy, on the other hand, flows. It comes into the ecosystem from the sun, is captured by producers. They capture the energy from the sun and form a food molecule that feeds everything else. So you have all types of consumers that are eating the producers, and then you have other consumers eating those consumers, etc. So energy flows from the sun through the photosynthesizer as one population feeds on the other. However, at the top level, our top level predator, what happens to the energy in this organism's structure once it dies? There's still energy in the molecules that make it up. So what happens to the energy in this body once it's died? Well, if you're a farmer, you know that composting, allowing organic, once living things to decompose, can produce heat. So as organic matter decomposes, that energy that was once in those molecules is actually released as heat. So this is what we're talking about when we say that energy flows. It flows through the ecosystem, and it's eventually given off as heat. And you can ask any farmer that's ever stacked hay in a barn. They're very familiar with this concept, because as hay starts to decompose in a barn, if you've not stacked it properly, it will get very, very hot as it starts to release that energy, and it can actually catch on fire. So you have to stack your hay properly, or your barn will burn down, literally. So we have to have a constant input of solar energy since it flows out of the ecosystem. If the energy input was ever halted, for instance, if the sun ever stopped producing energy, then the whole system would break down. Characteristic number 3, living things maintain homeostasis. I don't know if you've ever heard this word before, but it is basically just a state of biological balance. You're very familiar with it because you know that your body has to maintain a stable temperature. There's a very limited range at which your body can function with regard to temperature. Other physiological features that are very sensitive: acidity, moisture level. Your body has to make sure that the internal conditions stay within a certain boundary. So there are feedback systems within your body that constantly monitor your internal conditions. Very much like a thermostat. Your body is going to make automatic adjustments based on that feedback. If you get too hot, your body's going to take care of that, and you're going to sweat. You don't have any control over that. These automatic adjustments are not under your conscious control. If you get too cold, you start to shiver, and the muscle contractions will produce heat, which will warm your body. You can't control that. There are other organisms, many other organisms, that don't have the ability to internally regulate these physiological factors. They have to depend on behavior to regulate those factors. For instance, when we think about the reptiles that are ectothermic, their body temperature is dependent on the temperature of their surroundings, of their environment. So they still have to maintain that limited the boundary. They can't get too hot, they can't get too cold. So since their body doesn't take care of it for them, they have to physically move to different locations to either cool off or to warm up. Two very important physiological factors that have to be maintained are human blood pH, which needs to be between 7.35 and 7.45, and human body temperature, which needs to be around 98.6. The fourth characteristic of life is that living things respond. What does respond mean? Well, it's very simple. Living things interact and respond or react to their environment. And keep in mind, it could be something very, very simple. For instance, the illustration in the center of the screen of that plant growing toward the light. Many of you have seen that. That is a response to that plant's environment. Oftentimes the ability to respond will produce movement, very much like this little euglena right here that has the flagella that enables it to move. Oftentimes our ability to respond will help that organism to survive. It'll ensure the survival. But the total sum of the response of an organism is referred to as behavior. The fifth characteristic of life is that living things reproduce and develop. Very simply, reproduction is making another one like yourself. We're going to talk about this a lot this semester. The means of reproduction varies, just as animals are, or life in general on this planet is very, very diverse. So are the reproductive mechanisms. But we range from unicelled organisms, one cell, that simply divide or split in two to reproduce. We refer to that as asexual reproduction. Multicellular organisms have more complex means of reproduction. Most multicellular organisms will produce a specialized cell, we call it a gamete in animals, that will unite with another gamete of another individual and produce an offspring. We refer to that as sexual reproduction, the production of these specialized cells from two parents. But we'll talk more about asexual and sexual reproduction throughout the semester. Regardless of the manner of reproduction, when an organism reproduces, the genetic instructions for the new organism is passed from one generation to the next in genes. And most of you will recognize this structure right here as a chromosome. When we talk about genes, a gene is a piece of DNA that's contained within that chromosome. So as chromosomes are passed from parent to offspring, so are those instructions for development. So the gene is actually DNA. It's composed of DNA, deoxyribose nucleic acid, and we do pass them from parent to offspring. Changes can occur within this DNA. We know that. We're going to talk about that a lot this semester. Simply put, a change in the genetic information is referred to as a mutation. Don't want you to think of a mutation as negative connotation. Certainly there are some very, very bad mutations, and we're going to talk about some human genetic disorders that are a result of mutations in our DNA that do cause terrible consequences. However, simply put, the definition of a mutation is a change in the genetic information. Therefore, blue eyes is a mutation. We can actually trace back in human history when the first individuals with blue eyes were created. Prior to that, all individuals had brown eyes. And blue is simply a genetic change, a mutation. The sixth characteristic of life is that living things have adaptations. Very simply put, an adaptation is just a modification that's going to make an organism better suited for a specific environment. So it's a change. An adaptation is a change that's going to help that individual or that species. I want you to take a look at these two tortoises. These are actually very famous species of tortoise. These are Galapagos tortoises. They were the ones studied by Charles Darwin. And just realize that these two tortoises actually arose from a common ancestor tortoise. And what has happened here is that they were living tens of thousands of years ago on the Galapagos Islands, and the islands at that point in time were close together, and the tortoises could actually go between islands and breed. As time continued, the islands started spreading apart, and at some point they reached a distance where the tortoises could no longer go back and forth. So the tortoises on the islands at that point in time were stuck and started breeding among themselves, and thousands of years continued to pass, and this is what we have today. So these two tortoises come from two different islands in the Galapagos, and again, they are isolated. But think for just a moment, what would have caused, over thousands and thousands of years, this tortoise's shell to look like this, as opposed to something more like the tortoise on the left? And when you start looking at the islands and the environment and the feeding source for these tortoises, it becomes very obvious that this tortoise's shell is shaped like this because the food source for these tortoises on this particular island is up high. It's in the trees. That's where they get their food. So imagine that thousands of years ago, maybe a mutation had occurred that allowed a little crook in the shell. Well, that tortoise that had that mutation would have had an advantage. It could get more food and perhaps be healthier and reproduce more. So over years and years and many generations, this particular structure was actually an adaptation that gave the individuals who had it a benefit over the others and became widespread within the population on this island. So populations respond to environments over time by adapting to that environment. And again, look at this tortoise over here on the left. Where do you think its food source is? Yeah, you're right. Its food source is on the ground. So having a crooked shell didn't give anybody an advantage. So it was not one of those features or characteristics that would have been selected for. Bottom line is that the response to the environment will create diversity, and this is how we end up with animals and plants and all types of other living things on this planet that are so extremely diverse. And again, the adaptation, some of them are beneficial and cause the individuals to better survive and reproduce. And in a nutshell, that is what would lead to evolution or a change in the population.